No, I think on this one, Trump has it right. And he said it in a very Trumpian way. He said, "This is Biden's war. This isn't my war. This is a loser. I'm getting out of it. I don't want to be shackled with Biden's war."
So recently, Jeffrey Sachs went on the Krasno UNC podcast to talk a little bit about the war in Ukraine and why he thinks that Trump has the right idea when it comes to solving this, getting the U.S. out of it, and establishing peace. So let's watch Sachs talk about this and react.
Now you can unpack a
I
lot
thought
of
it was
that.
I thought it was Putin's war.
No, yes,
Biden didn't invade, I believe. It was Vladimir Putin who invaded Ukraine.
right. Well, I take a different view of this because I've watched this close up for 35 years. I was on the economic advisory team of President Mikhail Gorbachev. I was on the economic advisory team of President Boris Yeltsin, and I was on the economic advisory team of Ukraine's president, Leonid Kuchma. So I worked with both countries very close up, and they were not in any way in conflict for a long time. I believe it's not a popular view, I admit, but I've been there and I've seen it. I believe the United States actually walked Ukraine and Russia into this war.
Yeah, it's hard to deny that, especially after several different waves of NATO expansions and promises to include Ukraine in NATO when we knew that that was the red line that Russia wasn't willing to accept. And even William Burns, the CIA director under Biden, who in 2009 was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, wrote a letter to Condoleezza Rice telling her that directly. And we now know about that because of declassified documents due to WikiLeaks. So this is not, some kind of new conspiratorial theory. This is well-established history.
Not suddenly, not in 2022, but going back 30 years.
That was a deliberate strategy or just happened?
It was a kind of bluff. What the U.S. wanted, and it was decided as early as 1994, was that the U.S. would push NATO enlargement first to Central Europe, then to Eastern Europe, then into the former Soviet Union, right up against Russia's borders in Ukraine and in Georgia, the South Caucasus country. And I watched that process close up. I remember because I was a guest of Helmut Kohl in 1991. I was a guest of Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, in 1991 in Berlin because I was a lead advisor of the Polish government at the time. They promised to Gorbachev and to Yeltsin NATO was not going to expand and it was not going to take advantage of Gorbachev's unilateral end of the Soviet military alliance, the so-called Warsaw Pact, which Gorbachev unilaterally ended, saying the Cold War's over. We don't need a military alliance aiming at the West. And at that time, actually, even the date, February 7th, 1990, James Baker III and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the U.S. Secretary of State and the German Foreign Minister, said to Gorbachev and publicly, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. And Genscher was asked at the time, well, do you mean, Mr. Genscher, not to move into the new eastern part of Germany, which is going to unify with the Federal Republic of Germany? In other words, when the German Democratic Republic would unify, or do you mean more generally? He said, I mean more generally, we're not going to move eastward.
Yeah, Sachs is exactly right about this, and this is documented fact. We have a document that shows, and the only exception I'll take to what Sachs says is that my information shows that it was actually Jürgen Krobag, who was a subordinate of Hans-Dietrich Genscher, that actually made that very overt and explicit, that they weren't just talking about unifying Germany under a NATO army. They were talking about excluding countries to the east of the Elbe River. He said that specifically in the minutes so that Poland and other countries couldn't be included. He literally said Poland. So there's been some subterfuge out there and, you know, mistaken allegations by people that are very pro-Ukraine and pro-NATO that said, no, they're just talking about within the context of Germany and not talking about 1 inch eastward from Germany. But all the records show that that's clear. They'll also say stuff like, well, Gorbachev himself will say that that promise wasn't made. Well, he actually made contradictory statements on that, sometimes saying, indeed, that never happened, sometimes saying that it did happen. But thankfully, when allegations contradict, we go back to the original records and we have the minutes showing this. Both the Baker assertion and the Krobog assertion are available.
And then, as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, the American security state said, oh, come on, we have no enemies anymore, no one that can confront us. Rather than saying we have no enemies, we should end NATO, they said we have no enemies, we should expand NATO. We should make sure that Russia never returns, Soviet Union never returns, whatever.
Oh, that is, of course, you're right. This is the debate about promises given or not given.
Yes.
Which is very, you know, people have very different attitudes about that and very different opinions. And the claims are, you know, still wishy-washy because no written documents are available, but probably oral promises were made. And also, it is a question whether NATO expansion really should have happened or should not have happened. But
so he's a little mistaken there. There are assurances that are written down in the form of the minutes. Now, again, some supporters of Ukraine and NATO will say stuff, well, it's not in the actual NATO treaty that we couldn't expand 1 inch eastward. Well, under those grounds, the NATO treaty doesn't say that one power can't nuke the other power. But there are certain things on the table that two powers agreed to avert future conflicts. Some of them were verbally given with the full faith and credit behind the people giving them to each other, trusting one another as all diplomats must do to come to agreements sometimes. Not every specific thing is going to always be verbalized in a contract, but that doesn't mean that the essence and spirit of those assertions and those promises should just be disregarded. Otherwise, you know, you could do any kind of torture to another country, any kind of violations of the law of nations or international law, however you look at it, commit all sorts of war crimes that aren't specifically enumerated or written down in a treaty.
But even if that all was wrong and we say that was to be criticized, does that justify invading a country and killing civilians and bombing tower blocks and civilian infrastructure and people, of course? So did Putin have perhaps grievances, but then went well beyond to try to satisfy these grievances?
So before Sachs answers, he's already framing this as if history began in 2022. Like, is Putin justified when clearly Ukraine acted as a belligerent in some ways in this conflict, shelling the Donbass after, by the way, that the U.S. assisted in the overthrow of the Yanukovych government under what was called the Maidan coup of 2014. You know, the victors in that, which were antagonistic toward Russia, whereas Yanukovych was for neutrality and not rattling sabers with Russia, they, you know, wanted a more bellicose attitude toward Russia. And because of that, there was conflicts in the Donbass region, which are culturally Russian-speaking, culturally Russian in general, and they shelled cities there because what happened was in 2015, I believe, they had referendums that determined that the peoples living in those places wanted to be part of Russia. There was a measure on those regions voting for whether to restore an old constitution or whether to accept integration into Russia itself. Same with Crimea. Crimea, people just say, well, Vladimir Putin just, took it. Well, actually, 97% of the populace had an election either in 2014 or 2015 where they said they wanted to be part of Russia. If you believe in self-sovereignty of a country or the establishment of the U.S., where the U.S. did that, to break away from Great Britain, become our own country. In this case, they wanted to join a different country. You have to say that that's legitimate under the same grounds upon which Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. So there you go.
Well, there's one more step of this that's very important. Again, and by the way, on this question of NATO, I encourage people to go to George Washington University National Security Archives online and go to a website called What Gorbachev Heard, because it's got dozens of documents that lay all this out very, very explicitly. It's a wonderful program that George Washington University runs. But what became awful was that in 2008, after NATO had expanded to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic in 1999, and then to 7 more countries in 2004, to the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, to Bulgaria and Romania, and to Slovakia and Slovenia. So getting pretty far eastward, in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, George W. Bush Jr. insisted NATO will go to Ukraine and to Georgia, surrounding Russia in the Black Sea region. That was the idea that goes all the way back to Brzezinski.
Yeah, and this is something that doesn't get a lot of coverage now. Again, this has been swept under the rug. But both Clinton and then George W. Bush and then Obama said that Ukraine will be part of NATO. Bush did this at the end of his presidency. In fact, George Bush actually considered, striking Iran or executing a regime change against Iran under the advice of Dick Cheney, apparently at the end of his administration. And even George Bush, the butcher of Iraq, one of the most sinister warmongers in U.S. history, said, no, we can't do that, but we can be bellicose otherwise. And we're going to do that by pushing for Ukraine's inclusion in NATO. And that had catastrophic consequences, as we know. As we know that was the red line for Russia, always. They had told us explicitly.
In the mid-1990s. The Russians said no. And our former CIA director, William Burns, was at that point the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, and he wrote a famous long cable back to Condoleezza Rice, where he said the entire Russian political class is dead set against NATO enlargement to Ukraine because they view it as a national security threat. Now, the next step that's really important is what happened February 22nd, 2014, because that was when the Ukrainian president was overthrown, Viktor Yanukovych. That was quite notable because Yanukovych favored neutrality. He was considered pro-Russian. He did not want to bring Ukraine into NATO. He was elected in 2009, came into office in 2010, and he favored neutrality. He was overthrown on February 22nd, 2014. The Ukrainians that came to power called it the Revolution of Dignity. I call it a coup, a violent coup that the United States actively supported. And I happened to see some of it, sad to say, up close, because the U.S. funded a lot of the coup. And the Russians knew it. They actually intercepted a phone call between somebody who's now my colleague, actually at Columbia, Victoria Nuland. She was at the time the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. She made a call on an open phone to the U.S. Ambassador, Jeffrey Sachs, and they talked about in end of January 2014, who would be the next government. And by the way, at that point, Biden was vice president, and he was the one that was going to come seal the deal. It's all on the tape. It's shocking.
Yeah, this tape is still available. It's all over YouTube. You can Google this, but they're talking about things about like who must be part of this new provisional government, which they had just assisted in the overthrow of. And more information has come out about this recently because US aid was involved in pumping money into the Maidan revolution in those winter months of 2014 that kept the protests going. It wasn't a fully organic movement. Of course, some people in Ukraine did support that, but Yanukovych was the democratically elected president. And for all this talk about defending democracy, the US sure didn't have a problem with completely disbanding Ukrainian democracy when it came to perpetuating its interests in the grand scheme of empire and empire building.
Shocking call. So my view is many historians agree with me, others argue the point, but my view is the United States was part of an active regime change operation because they wanted to overthrow a president that opposed neutrality.
Yeah, this is so true. And after that, we know what happened in the years following. The corporate media never talks about it, of course, because again, history began in what was it, February of 2022 when Putin invaded Ukraine. But what happened before that was the overthrow of that government, red lines being established, you can't add Ukraine to NATO, US putting dual purpose rockets essentially on Russia's border that could be used for offensive purposes as well as defensive purposes. And what would the US do? Well, we know what was done during the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union was pumping in weaponry to Cuba. We know how the US responded to that. And it wasn't just going to sit by idly and let them do that. The same way that today, the US would not sit by idly if China, completely subverts the democratically elected government of Mexico, puts its weaponry on the border, and wants to include Mexico in its military alliance. That would not fly. So after that overthrow in 2014, the Maidan Revolution, the Ukrainian government got into a kind of soft, off and on again civil war, kind of like a quasi-civil war for 7 or 8 years, where villages in the Donbass were shelled because of their resistance to Ukraine and this government, which they, I think, rightly believed was illegitimate. So that's the run-up. There's so many off-ramps to this thing, and that's the biggest tragedy about it. And Zelensky had an off-ramp, too, in Istanbul when, just weeks after the war began, there was a potential peace deal on the table that he was talked out of by Boris Johnson and probably the U.S. State Department intervention from Biden. And what's so horrific about that is it never had to get to this point where hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died in this thing, hundreds of thousands of Russians have died in this thing, conscription expansion in Ukraine, shutting down Eastern Orthodox churches, disbanding opposition parties. Zelensky has established dictatorial rule there. And he had the ability to have such a better deal in Istanbul because Putin wasn't even staking out claims to the Donbass at that time. So Ukraine could have retained all the Donbass territory that they've since lost, and they will lose. There's no way that's going to go back. There's no way that Crimea is going back. And here we are a few months into Trump's administration, and it seems like we're back to status quo for the most part, but Trump is addressing this better by dealing directly with Russia, diplomatic extension to Russia and Lavrov. They just met recently. Witkov just met with Putin recently. So let's see what comes from it. So let me know in the comments below. Do you think that a peace will be established in Ukraine soon? I'd love to hear from you on that. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, continue following it if you want to see more videos like this. And until next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll see you in the next one.